Welcome to Bad Dog Agility, a podcast helping you reach all of your dog agility goals. Whether it's competing under the bright lights of the televised finals at Westminster or successfully navigating a homemade course in your own backyard, we'll bring you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
The show starts with your hosts, Jennifer, Esteban, and Sarah.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 374. Today's podcast is powered by Canine Handler Fitness with Liz Joyce, built for agility handlers who want to keep up with their dogs. With Liz's all-access pass, agility handlers at every fitness level can hop in right where they are and work towards their specific goals. From building strength and balance to boosting speed and stamina, these short, effective workouts target exactly what you need on course. Your dog's ready. Are you? Head to caninehandlerfitness.com to get started today. Today, we're going to teach you how you can fail better. And so by that, I mean, when you fail, let's get something out of it. Let's get something out of our failure.
I think agility is a sport of mistakes, right? And success is often graded in, just like when you're back in school, right? What score do you get when you run clean in the AKC
100.
at least?
You get 100. Yep.
You get 100. And if you get eliminated, you don't even get a score.
Right.
You put
get
a big
an E.
E on the sheet.
Might as well be
Eliminated.
an F.
Yeah. And then you can get other grades as well. Drop a bar. You might be 5 points off, or depending on the competition, right?
Right.
Miss a contact, another 5 points off. And of course, only 100 gets you the actual Q or a qualifying run such that it counts toward your title or maybe a qualification to go to a big event like the national championship.
Right.
Right. So I think a lot of that is probably borrowed just straight from the American educational system.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I think it's pretty interesting because when we think about mistakes, dealing with them has been a problem, or it's always a problem, I think, for a lot of handlers.
Right. A lot of humans, a lot of students, a lot of kids, a lot of people, you know.
But I mean, specifically in dog agility, whereas I feel like in other sports, the competition is not really based on the American educational model, right? So
it's not based on perfection.
Yes, that's so well put, right? Because if you look at a sport like baseball,
I was going to say basketball, but sure, you could do yours.
Well, let's start with baseball then. You're right. I mean, I don't even watch baseball, but like great hitters are not batting 1,000, which means perfect, right? They hit everything. You know, good hitters will hit like 300s. So you're hitting like, I don't know, 30%, 35%.
Right. I mean, that's
the time. What happens the other 2/3 of the time?
Right. Exactly.
You're sitting down, right? You're not even making it to first base. But that is what success looks like in that sport, right?
That's what I think about.
Lose sight of that. Go ahead and about basketball.
With like basketball, I mean, I guess the thoughts that I have are essentially along the same lines, which are, if you're watching the NBA finals, like how many of those shots go in and how many of them don't, right? There's plenty of shots taken that do not go in, and it is built into the game, right? It is part of the game. But somehow in agility, we feel like mistakes are not part of the game. They are they're taken.
Bad.
Yeah, they're bad. And they mean it was a worthless run. It didn't mean anything. Those kinds of mentalities, instead of recognizing that it's just part of the game. When are you going to have a mistake? When are you going to hold it together? When are you going to trip? Like, it is just part of the nature of the sport.
Right. And so I think an interesting concept to introduce, which we may or may not have mentioned on other podcasts, but you can think of the course as a challenge. I think a lot of people do that, right? But think of the course as asking you a question, or that the judge who designed the course is asking you a question, right? And the judge is asking, can you handle this, right? Or for a very specific part of the course that may be technically difficult, do you have this particular skill, or do you have the skill to handle this particular challenge? I think it's probably a better way to put it. And you either can or you can't yet.
Right.
Right. So adding the yet, I think, is critical. because it frames it in terms of getting information about you and your dog and your abilities at this time, right? So a run that does not go as planned just gives you homework.
Right.
That's all it is. You have made a mistake or several mistakes, or your dog has made mistakes, and now you have information, and that information is very valuable because that information should be dictating your training.
Right.
Right. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there, especially for beginners, because they don't let necessarily their mistakes dictate their training, right? Their training is dictated to them. They attend a weekly class, right? You have an instructor. There is a curriculum often at these agility schools, or if you're training with someone online, right? You might be going through some kind of course where, you're going to work threadles this week and backsides the next week. Maybe you had a problem with your rear cross and the dog went off course, but there's no rear cross in this particular online course, right? So a lot of times that can be dictated to you, and your training is not, in my opinion, properly built, right? Because as mistakes happen, you want to address them. Now, of course, we've all run into that situation where you have to make the same mistake multiple times. And then you're like, okay, I am finally sick of my dog breaking their start line and taking off. So I need to do something about this. And then you go and you find the resources or work with someone to tackle that particular problem. Right. But I just think it's very useful to think of it that way.
Right. And I think you phrased it the first time I have heard you phrase it this way, that the judge is asking you a question, was actually on the last podcast on burnout. And I think it was burnout. Anyway, in one of the last two podcasts, and you made that statement. The judge is simply asking you a question. Can you do this? And the answer is yes or no. And I thought that was a really succinct way of putting it. And it was immediately like a phrase that somebody kind of reflected back to us in our VIP group. Somebody said they really loved that podcast, and they were like, I had a bad weekend, and then I was listening to your podcast, and then I just, sat down and thought like, okay, the judge asked the question. The answer was no. What is my homework? What am I going to work on? How am I going to improve? And so I do really like that, just that concept of, can you handle this? And I think when you talked about practice, and then the trial giving you homework, I think the way a lot of people think is they think that practice is the thing that you can do so that you can go compete. And when competition doesn't go well, it's frustrating because the whole thing is built around you being able to go and get your cues and get your ribbons and have your fun, in a trial. And so you don't think of it as information. You think of it as the end. And then when mistakes happen, you realize, okay, well, I'm not at the end anymore, right? Now I have to go backwards. I have to go back and train. And, people think of it, I think, a little bit too linearly, right? I get a dog, I train them when they're puppies, and then I train their foundations, and then I train their obstacles, and then I train the handling, and then I get to compete. Right. And I'm done. Right. I'm done. I get to go compete. But it should be like a never ending cycle. It's truly never ending with your dog.
Well, I think that's a good point. So you're saying, possibly you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that some people approach practice probably the way we're advising you to, which is to, I'm making a mistake. Now we're going to work through this mistake. And then they kind of test themselves. The trials become the test. Right.
Right.
And then when they have mistakes there, it's not, these are mistakes, and now it's back to the drawing board, but it's like devastation. Like, I have failed.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think there's a lot, like, this is very analogous, I think, again, to schools, right? And in schools, when we look at assessments that teachers use, right, there are two main kinds of assessments, right? So this is a little technical, but formative assessments and summative assessments, right? And so a formative assessment might be like a practice quiz, right? Or at the end of a lesson, the teacher asks, okay, so who shot Abraham Lincoln, right? And then you kind of figure out which kids know and learn the lesson and which ones didn't. but it's not something that you're going to sit down and write some kind of total final grade for the entire course. That's the summative assessment, right? A final exam, something used to measure mastery, right? So that there are different kinds of assessments, right? And so in agility, you might think of practice as your formative assessments, right? These are your little practice pop quizzes, right? They're worth less if they're entered in the grade book at all. And then you have the big summative final exams that tend to be trials, right?
Right.
And I think I took a huge leap forward as a handler and a competitor when I put everything into that formative practice quiz mindset, including regular trials.
And included even something like nationals. You make a mistake in nationals, well, that is, I have homework from, like,
the next nationals.
I've heard Jennifer Crank come home from the world championship and say, here is my homework from worlds.
And they immediately set up the course that, had the lowest Q rate, and everybody was buzzing about it online, and there were so many complaints. But people like us, people like Jennifer, they're out there setting up the course and working through them, right? Because the judge asked the question, the vast majority of people failed, and so now everybody's got a new homework assignment, right? And so I think thinking about it that way in terms of mistakes being information and then immediately guiding your training, right? So I think that is a very powerful concept. Okay. Now, why are mistakes so painful? Like, what happens when things go really, really wrong, right? And people, trainers and handlers go off the rails here. Well, when you look at kids who get grades at school, right? They start to see grades as a measure of self-worth.
Right.
Not just kids who get bad grades. I'm talking about kids who get good grades.
Right.
Right. And frequently, I think agility handlers find themselves in this situation because you tend to do very well in novice and open relative to your first experiences in excellent or masters or, the higher levels of agility. Or maybe you were very good all the way up to the national level and you went out for international style courses and you got smashed, right? You just really didn't do well at all. And you have already come to see your performance in agility as a measure of self-worth. And so suddenly, when the grades aren't there, you're not making the grade anymore. Guess what happens to your self-worth?
Right.
Right? So when your grades define you, mistakes can really hurt your confidence. Might even lead to avoidance, giving up, right? Blame, damages a relationship, not only to the sport, but even with your dog, right? Because someone's got to take the blame in your mind.
Right.
Right. And it's either going to be you or your dog or some combination of the two. That's going to create a lot of pressure, anxiety. You might be a little less willing to take risks. And this is a very performance-based kind of self-esteem, right? Failure now becomes deeply personal.
Right.
Right. It's about who you are as a person, right? It's no longer informational. It's no longer a game that you're trying to master, right? Because you're an agility handler and now you are making all these mistakes. Therefore, you are a failure. You are not good at that sport, right? And your self-esteem can take a really big hit. Okay. So, Sarah, in your opinion, what do we need to do to kind of turn that around?
Right. I mean, I think we kind of started this podcast with it. I think it's the failure as information. And I think that's where, I've been accused of having a bit of a robot brain, being a computer science person, thinking very analytically and kind of everything that I do in life kind of comes down to if this, then that. Right? If this, then that. If this other thing, then this other thing. Right? And so it's like, if I succeed, then what's my next step, right? Maybe I look for a different area where I'm struggling, where I need to put in some training time or whatever. But if I fail, what is the next step? And it's usually going to be some sort of training, some sort of going back and filling a hole in my training. But it's just when it's an if this or that, it's just not very personal anymore. And so it just makes it so much easier.
Yeah, and the last thing that I really want to say about it is sometimes, especially in dog agility, especially when we're coming out with these young dogs, especially if it's not your first dog, there's a whole big thing about performance being predictive. Okay. And I'll tell you a little bit, just very briefly, about our daughter, our son and our daughter. So this is just pure academics, right? So our son was, he pretty gifted dude and did very well on early testing, right? So they test these kids when they're like 4 and in kindergarten and first grade and all that kind of stuff, right? And so, they give these tests and they're like, hey, your kid is like good. And we've identified them for this program or that program. They have like gifted and talented programs here in the United States. And they kind of funnel these kids into them and they get a little bit more challenging work or a little bit more advanced work. So they don't get bored in class, right? They tend to do a little bit better than they otherwise would. And so, he was kind of identified early and did all that stuff and, went on to have a great academic career. Of course, now he's in college, right? He's a very bright kid, like accepted early to MIT kind of kid. And he ended up going to Brown University, where he is now in his 3rd year studying a double major, computer science and linguistics, right? Exceptionally bright person. Great kid. And his sister came along and we felt like they're like 2 peas in a pod.
And she's 5.5 years younger.
Well, so when she started off with the early tests, they were good. I would say that they were great, but they were not where he was at. Right. And then I think that around, I don't know when they do it, but the GT Academy. So here we have, our kids are in the public school system. We decided to go that route rather than private school. And we're here in Texas. And so they have something called the GT Academy. Kids get pulled out of their various middle schools and sent to a central location. And her brother, our son, did that. And so we just assumed she would do it too, right? And so they did the testing and they were like, you know what? No. They were like, no. There's an appeal. We appealed. They were still like, no. And I was like, okay, what does this mean? And so we're immediately faced with the question of, what does this mean? And what we decided that it meant was absolutely nothing.
I was about to say nothing.
Nothing, right? And I think, with the success that our son had, now imagine as you're listening to this, as you listen to the story, imagine that your first dog is just really exceptional and does all these things. And the second dog comes along. And they're like, they're not hitting the same markers at about the same age, at about the same time. You're like, what does this mean? Does this mean that this dog is not going to be as good as the other dog? I think we really fall into something that's very predictive. Of course, now the punchline here is our daughter is 10th grade and of course has like essentially tied or surpassed our son in every
single measure.
every single measure. She was invited to all these different math competitions. She recently got, some like, they just took, I think the junior year, 11th grade. She's not even an 11th grader, a 10th grader. They invited her to, I think, take the PSAT, where she had a perfect score on the math section, right? Like this, and she was invited to some national math competition. Very bright child, like outscoring her brother across the board on the math side, right? I credit her mom with that. I was good at math, but I think you're better than me at math. So, but there's like we have no doubts about her and we treated her the same. And I think this is the critical point here. Once we decided that was information, right? But it was not who she was. And more importantly, it did not predict who she could become. Right? And once we put that into action, I think the rest is history.
Yeah. Fell into place.
Everything fell into place. And so I think this is what we would want for you and your dogs, right? And I understand some dogs are better at agility than other dogs. Some dogs are easier to train than other dogs. But hopefully we've kind of outlined where the dangers here are for you as a handler and given you a way to think about it, to reframe it in a way where you know what you need to do, right? It's homework, right? I made a mistake. I couldn't do something. We couldn't do something. Now I have homework. Now I know what to do. Thank you very much for showing me this weakness that we're going to work on, right? And it is not predictive of who you can become in terms of accomplishments. But of course, we're always like, well, be careful, like being very results oriented, right? And it, regardless of those accomplishments, whether, they knock that bar in the final and you're the champ, or you're not the champ, or they keep the bar up and then you're the champ. Either way, you're going through that same process. And that process is, in my opinion, the thing about the sport, because what underlies that process, the thing that underlies that process is the relationship between you and your dog, right? And the challenges you're taking on, the things that you're training through. It almost doesn't matter what the answer is.
Right.
You know what I mean? So in closing, I would say, of course, what we're saying is separate your self-worth from these results, right? But every course is essentially a question, right? The judge is asking you a question. Every mistake is instantaneous feedback. It kind of dictates what you should do next. The only way to really fail here is quitting. Yeah, so I'm not saying, don't take a break. I'm not saying sometimes, a dog is better suited elsewhere on a different style of course, or, at a lower jump height or in a different organization or needs to retire. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about truly giving up on the learning process, right? Think about your last run where you had a mistake, right? So I would end with this. What homework did your last run give to you?
I think that's a perfect way for everybody to think about their performance as they go to their next trial this weekend, come back with their homework, and hopefully have a little bit of a different attitude towards any mistakes that they make. And that's it for this week's podcast. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Canine Handler Fitness with Liz Joyce. Happy training.
Thank you for listening to Bad Dog Agility. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information, updates, and links to all our socials, just check out our website, www.baddogagility.com. If you haven't already signed up for our email subscription, we would love to have you join the BDA community. Until next time, take care.